Please welcome to the stage Maryam Rasheed, Senior Analyst at Economist Impact. His Excellency Ambassador Majid Suwaidi, CEO of Alterra, and Dr. Vera Songwe, Chair and Founder of Liquidity and Sustainability Facility.
They're looking for me.
Hope so.
Can we hear me okay? Yes? Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Panel, thank you for joining us as well. It's been a morning of really interesting conversations that really have just gone so nuanced with conversations around funding and resilience. And it's been a pleasure to sort of watch that and continue on from that, knowing that there are more conversations to still be had. And as we get into charting pathways for economic growth, just to introduce myself very briefly, my name is Maryam Rasheed. I'm a senior analyst at Economist Impact, focused quite on the sustainability space. May I ask our panelists to give us a brief introduction of themselves as well?
I'm Majid Suwaidi. I'm CEO of Alterra.
I'm Vera Songwe. I'm the chairperson and founder of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility.
Great. So to just get started, to give us a little bit of a background on how I came about this. So when I was presented with this panel, the idea of the economic growth was one that really stood out to me. Again, I always feel like panels around this, there's always so much to be said. There's so many dimensions of economic impact to economic growth really to be explored. But one aspect of the title that I took a little bit of apprehension away from is the whole charting pathways idea. And I think it's a little consultant speaky. And as a former consultant, I think I can say that. But I think there could also be a power perceived in simplicity. And the more I dug into it, I really started to see these roadmaps for net zero be super impactful for regions like Thailand and Vietnam when it came to sustainable agriculture, when it came to circular economy and the like. And I started to see the immense value that these roadmaps or these structures started to have, especially in the global south, where resources are fairly constricted. There are some geopolitical challenges present. There are shifting dynamics. There are shifting divides. And as we sit on this panel and start to address strength, diversity, and unevenness in the regions that would benefit most from these charting of pathways for economic growth, maybe we can start off by talking about resilience in particular. And Dr. Vera, maybe to tap on you first, there's obviously a lot of talk about the importance of inclusive economic growth. And we do have an idea of what that looks like in theory. But I'm curious to hear what that looks like practically for you, how sort of community and country empowerment fits into that, and where the sort of non-negotiables really lie that we're not seeing when we talk about inclusive economic growth.
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's good to see you again. Good to have these conversations at the Sustainability Week. I think two things. It is true and a very important question about sort of let's go to the community, but it is almost impossible to get to the communities without talking about the macro. And today we are living in a world where, we still have high cost of living, inflation globally is high, G7 countries are highly indebted, African countries, 60% of them are in debt distress. So there is a macro, I think, conversation that needs to be had. And the reason the macro conversation is important is because inflation is the fastest creator of poverty, is the fastest creator of the inability then to be able to build resilience. And so if we cannot make sure that sort of the prices of basic goods, including energy, of course, are are affordable, then it's very difficult to dig in. And so I think that's one of the most important conversations we need to have is one, how can we ensure that at the macroeconomic level, we're getting the kind of stability, we're getting the kind of growth that we need from the G7, from the G20, and then how it trickles down to the rest of the economies. The global economy has been resilient, and so that's where the resilience story kind of starts, right? We haven't sort of skidded into a recession. Data just came out yesterday. I think Germany is going into its second year of slow growth. But Europe overall has been able to sort of manage its inflation, and so the cost of capital is lower. If the cost of capital is lower there, then it's much cheaper for them to on-lend to the emerging markets, to the developing economies. And so I think, and a very practical example of that is we just finished, the World Bank Group finished the big round of raising resources for the poorest countries in the world. And even though contributions of some countries went up, because of inflation and because of exchange rate, the resources were much smaller. And so we do need to manage, I think, sort of this sort of global economic demands first and make sure that we get that right before we can manage the middle. And this is where I think building on the UAE consensus, which we worked very closely with you on, during the COP28 period, we talked about the 9 pillars of finance and inclusion, right? And so you have domestic resource mobilization, you have private sector, you have concessional money, you have the just transition, but most importantly, it's the ambitions of the people. It's where can we put the ambitions of the people and how do they go? And I think this is why these conversations are important, is those ambitions create the resilience that we need at the micro level. And once we have the ambitions clear, and then you get the country platforms, then we come to Majid and everybody else to bring in the private finance and the concessional finance to allow it to realize the dream that we hope that we can get.
And to just follow on from that, you did touch upon this idea of these systems at play that we really need to discuss when we're talking about these micro-level acts of resilience as well. as well. And His Excellency, I just wanted to then ask you, so as we are talking about these macro systems, the idea of local ownership is one that seems to appear in these conversations. There is a lot of concentration of wealth in certain areas and impact of disruption in others. Where the wealth is concentrated may not be where impact is most desired. How is this affecting resilience and how we're seeing these regions aspire towards true economic and sustainable growth?
Well, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on such a panel along with Vera, who's been really a leader in the thought space when it comes to finance. And honestly, I think that we all know that the global south, particularly the developing world, hasn't gotten the resources that it needs to be able to take the strides that we want to see when it comes to economic development. And yes, today we sort of have this inequality with the concentration of wealth, but you spoke to the fact that we need to see more local growth. And that's going to come in multiple ways. There's never a silver bullet for any of these problems. And I think that there's a discussion that needs to be had at a macro level. So we need to be, at COP28 and then at COP29, we saw some strides forwards in how we can start to address the macro discussion. I think that there's still a lot of room for us to bring a more comprehensive macro level conversation together in a more coherent way. And then, as you said, Vera, then that will incentivize the private sector to come in. We know that there are still a lot of barriers there that prevent the private sector from really coming in at scale. And those barriers are both at that macro level, but also at a local level. Every country needs to be looking at how can it be incentivizing local entrepreneurs, project developers, business people to be investing their capital. And I think that as that capacity grows, then you'll start to see the flows coming in, because we know that the future of global growth is in the global south. And so that needs to be led by the global south. It needs to be led by local players, people who know what's needed in their local market, what type of renewable energy suits that particular environment, what type of building materials suit that particular environment, and what do does the local community need most. And so where we can empower those entrepreneurs at a local level and then bring in the private sector finance from other parts of the world, that's where we can really achieve the scale that we need to do. To date, we've kind of had these sort of piecemeal projects, these sort of nice showpieces, nice to have projects that demonstrate. Now we need to move to that next step where we really achieve scale and we really make this part of the mindset of the development story.
I'm curious to know, and again, question for the panel, touching upon something that you mentioned about really putting that responsibility to engage and mobilize at the grassroots in the hands of these leaders in the global south. Are there particular examples that you and your experiences in this space have come across where you've noted it to be quite impeccable and quite inspiring to see any sorts of grassroots level mobilization that's quite notable as a sort of best practice in this space for either of you?
Vera, you're maybe a bit better at this than me. You've had more experience. I think that when I traveled around during COP28, I saw a lot of solutions happening at a local level that really suited. I think that one of the things that we've always talked about, here in the UAE, we're a country that has developed really rapidly, and we've done that because we've developed solutions that work for the UAE and work for our environment. I can remember a while back when they were looking at energy efficiency for buildings. We were trying to look at standards that came from around the world, from the US or Europe, and those standards required us to have reservoirs on the roof of our houses to capture rainwater. Obviously, in the UAE, those are dust collectors. They're not water collectors, right? So we had to refine those policies to make efficiency standards or development standards that suited the UAE. Those are you see that time and time again when you go to other parts of the world, where governments can put in place policies or standards that suit their particular environment. Then that allows the entrepreneurs and the developers and the project developers in their local communities to come up with the solutions. And then that's what will attracts the private sector. So it's a joint project that we all need to be part of.
No, that's quite sound. Was there anything to add on your end, Dr. Vera?
No, I think one that comes to mind very quickly is a project out of Kenya. It's the Earthshot Prize, one of the Earthshot Prize winners, which essentially is a young woman who was able to sort of build new cooking devices, but that were also sort of anti-malaria prone, so she could cook and protect her kids. But I think there are many of the solutions, but as you said, the importance is how you scale them. The solutions are only as good as the ability to scale, and the climate crisis that we have ahead of us is not a crisis where we love small things. It has to be one where we are finding big solutions, right? It is maybe a grassroots solution from China today where solar panels cost 4 cents to install. Can we roll it out across, the 600 million people that do not have access? I think that's really what we are looking for. So there is always a little bit of a tension between the need to own nice little grassroots solutions. The nice little grassroots solutions do not absorb $30 billion from Alterra. We need to absorb $30 billion from Alterra to solve a problem. It is $1 trillion problem. In the report that we did with Nick Stern and Amma Bhattacharya, that's the size of the problem. And so the worry, I think, is that when Majid shows up with $30 billion, he's looking for the kind of project that is going to impact 20 million people, that we can roll out in 7, 8, 9 countries with 100 million people. And yes, those start with small local projects, but we need to scale them very fast. And I think that's where we're still having a little bit of a stress, is how you take, the small malaria project or the energy project, and Mazda has done that. We're here today with Mazda in Brazil, which is the next COP30. I think there's an amazing BNDES, the National Development Bank of Brazil, has done more projects, or maybe equivalent to Mazda, on renewable energy. That's the kind of scale that we need to be able to talk about.
Yeah. There's also some systemic issues that I think that we need to think about, right? So we have issues of currency, right? FX. Risk. We have issues of debt that we need to address. When we're talking about climate and the climate challenge, it has to be a holistic approach. And as we were talking, I was just thinking of one very, very simple example that's not what you asked. You asked for a positive story, but there are very simple examples of where we're making the wrong choices, not because they aren't the right choices. And it was in Kenya. I went to the Dadaab refugee camp there, and we met with the local community who were being impacted by the flood of refugees that were coming into that refugee camp. By the way, this is a camp of 300,000 people. This is a city. That's a 300,000 person community right there. But the local community were being impacted by those same drought conditions, and they were farmers, and because renewables were considered to be a high-risk investment or a cutting-edge technology, if you will, their financing only allowed them to buy a diesel pump for their water. So because the diesel pump they couldn't afford the fuel for the diesel pump, they could only run it part of the time. So they can only get the financing for the thing that they can't even run most of the time. But a solar array they could run all day long, they could pump the water and they could do their farming, and they knew about it, but they weren't able to get the financing for it because the finance providers that they had considered it to be a technology that wasn't investable for them. So these small types of changes to decision making can have a big impact. And then if you take that and scale that up to the level, which is what Vera and I think about, where how do you get power to 300,000 people or to 1 million people, or how do you create sustainable or resilient living conditions to large communities across regions, then these kinds of changes need to happen, and they need to happen at scale, and that will only happen if we collaborate internationally, I think, to solve some of these challenges.
That's incredibly interesting, and so many interesting points that you've mentioned that I do want to come back to. But as we're talking about it now, as I was researching this topic, there is a sort of ill of privatizing innovation that we're seeing be maybe a hindrance for certain sectors that are on their pathway towards true sustainable economic growth, and that's agriculture is definitely one of them. But how much are we seeing it in actuality be a hindrance or a necessity? How is it impacting scale as you are perceiving it in your space?
I mean, that's a good question. I think one of the easiest ways of thinking about sort of privatizing solutions is we now have what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially, particularly in the European Union, where the European Union is now sort of putting a levy on any kind of import of a commodity that was produced with methodologies that are carbon emitting. And so if you look at that, essentially, if you're Egypt, for example, 9% of your exports are in steel, cement, fertilizers, which are carbon emitting. And then the question becomes, can we share technology? Because if you can share technology, if the European companies can then share the technology to improve and do green steel as Germany is doing today, then the cost of importing steel from Egypt is going to go down because they will not have the sort of carbon intensity that the European Union does not want. And so there is a private component to the business of clean energy, which we need to begin to remove. There needs to be a governance system around it. The next issue is around carbon markets, where we have privatized carbon markets, but we haven't been able to create a governance system that is good enough. And so the price of DNA of carbon in Kenya or Cameroon is much lower. It's $5 for the same DNA and $75 in Norway. We do need, again, a governance system, a multilateral development system that can come together and level the pricing so that then indigenous communities, local communities can receive the same kinds of resources that are needed for them to be able to aspire to begin to make the changes that are needed and use the resources importantly. So the environment is a global public good, but we have sliced some of that into private commodities. But those private commodities need a better governance system, and today we don't have one that can allow us then to sort of function equitably in that framework. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing, Baku, Belen, and what we did with the UAE is trying to figure out whether we can create the right governance system so that, yes, the private sector, we need the private sector to continue to be profit-making and run the businesses, because that's how innovation happens. But once you have enough innovation, can you then share it enough so that the problem that we're facing, which is global, can be addressed much faster?
I'm curious to ask, I'm sorry, was there something to add?
No, I was just thinking about the point you made about equity. I mean, I think Vera, always sums it up much better than I do. But we need to think about what are those models that we can really scale that can ensure that a developing country can continue on its economic growth trajectory, achieve its economic aspirations for its people, raise the standard of those people, but make sure it's in a resilient way while we reduce our emissions. And this is a challenge, Vera pointed out the example of steel. As we grow and develop our economies, we're all going to need steel, and we want to make sure that that's the greenest steel possible. So how do we ensure, but if those technologies to do that are only kept within certain economies and they're not spread globally, how do we ensure that those technologies get to where they need to allow those communities to develop economically and see the growth they do? And that can only happen, I believe, through really robust international processes that give the market then the confidence to come in and come behind it and make the investments that are needed.
I'm thinking about it in terms of, okay, we've discussed this in terms of the technologies to initiate us a little bit further on these pathways. But in terms of skills, are we seeing a sort of disparity and a similar market-led approach to ensuring that the skill set to utilize these innovations, to scale these innovations exists a little bit more equitably than the technologies do? Or not so much?
I think that we live in a world, fortunately, where skills are transferred internationally much more easily. However, we do know that there is divides, poverty divides, digital poverty divides that prevent information or capacity achieving places. I think that this is something that even here in the UAE, where we are thankfully, because of our resources and the wise investment of our leadership, we've been able to upskill our people, and we've been able to make advances. If you extend that to other countries where they might not necessarily, and even here it's still a challenge to stay competitive. If you then take that to a place where there are many demands on resources, financial resources, creating the skilled workforce that's needed for these new leaps can be a challenge. And so that is something that we should be investing in, because, by the way, if developing countries are prosperous, we're all prosperous, because if that's where the future population growth is, that's where the future emissions growth is, then we need to be investing in these communities, because that makes economic sense for all of us. And so I think that is something that is an area where we do need to really think hard. A lot of times when we talk in these international agreements about monitoring and reporting, many developing countries simply don't have the resources or the capacity even to be able to do some of this monitoring and reporting that is required. Let's help them to get up the curve to be able to do that, and then that creates the opportunities for all of us to work and collaborate together.
And with that, I think we can start to talk about those enablers a little bit more, in particular the funding factor, the finance factor. And we've been talking about it through this session as well, but to just put perhaps you, His Excellency, on the spot a little bit, and ask where the financial models that are governing this kind of growth, this kind of equitable growth, are excelling, and where they're falling short, and whether, in your experience, you've perceived an optimal mix or spectrums of mix, rather, in delivering that actual impact.
Well, Vera is the expert in this area, and I think that I won't spend too much time, because I think that her thoughts on this would probably be much more helpful to us all. I can only speak for what we know or what we are doing at Alterra. When we were in COP28 and we knew we needed to provide a contribution, we looked across the spectrum of solutions that were out there for, okay, what were the models that could mobilize capital? And we brought together our financial experts here in the UAE, and we partnered with others from around the world to say, if we were to design a vehicle that would help address not all the problems in the landscape of climate finance, but some, what would we do? And we knew that there were already funds out there for instance, Abu Dhabi Funds for Development that were providing development finance, or were providing the GCF is providing green climate finance. Those sort of concessional vehicles existed. We also knew that there was private sector vehicles out there that were hungry to invest in the right situations into climate and into resilience, but they weren't able, because they didn't have the right incentives, or they weren't being given the mandate to do so. I think that one of the things is we always look to the private sector and say, oh, why don't they invest in climate in the developing world? Well, a lot of them have responsibilities to their pension holders, to their investors, to folks who, it's our pension funds. I was often asked, why don't our sovereign wealth funds invest in development? Well, that's not the role of those organizations. So what we thought about was how could we create something in between? And that's where we came up with Alterra. And so far, that has been extremely successful. And the model that we used, and we're not saying that this is exactly the model that everybody should use, but we want to see others replicate it, was to create these. We've invested across 7 strategies with 3 major partners. We chose Brookfield, BlackRock, and TPG because we knew that they were large existing institutions that we already had relationships with that we could work with, and said, what can we do to help them to help us mobilize capital into the global south? We knew that we needed to deploy capital quickly, so invested across 7 different strategies with these partners. With Brookfield's infrastructure, with TPG's more private equity, with BlackRock it's a little bit of a mixture of debt, equity, and infrastructure investments. And then, but most excitingly, what we did was we created these 2 dedicated, brand new Global South funds, which we seeded each with about 500 million. And we created a third, which is a sort of a revamp of an existing BlackRock fund. And we said to them, hey, go out and mobilize as much capital as you can. When we started, we were told by consultants that we maybe would get 1 time or 2 times our money. And we said, great, at least we're providing contribution. Today, we have seen that they've been able to raise 4 to 9 times the capital on top of our principal amount. And what we've done is given, through the model approach, this FICO, first in, capped out approach that we've taken, we've given an incentive to the other investors to come in, and we partner with BlackRock, and then they're going to go out and be deploying capital at scale in the developing world. And so we think that this is really a game changer. In fact, we know it's a game changer because we can see it happening firsthand. But we need to see more innovative models like that, where governments can perhaps collaborate to take on some of the risk, provide guarantees, provide first loss capital. Maybe we can bring in a little bit of philanthropy and their support. But we really need to move from what we've been talking about, this kind of like piecemeal project-based approach that we've had, to solutions like what Alterra has proposed, which is scale. Because as you said at the outset of this conversation, we can do nice showpiece projects, but if we don't scale those in a place like Kenya, in a place like Rwanda, in a place like Vietnam or Indonesia, then we're never going to move the needle. And that's why I think Alterra is different, because our 30 billion of catalytic capital is really mobilizing multiples, and we hope that by 2030 we will have been able to mobilize 250 billion. And if we can collaborate with governments, philanthropy and others, international institutions like IHC, who we've been talking to in the World Bank, if we can collaborate to scale that up and speed that up, and others do the same, I think that we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the know-how. There is no reason why we can't solve this climate challenge that we have today. It's really possible.
You said it all. No, I think that what Alterra has done is really demonstrate the ability to leverage. And what we have been looking for was a leveraging ability, and really the roles of the World Bank, and we've even seen with the IMF and the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, is that if you can bring in that kind of concessional capital, which comes not only as sort of cheaper capital, but capital that comes with knowledge associated with it, and that's the strength of this big development institutions, the EBRD and all the others. Then you bring in a private sector, first, there's a first loss. A lot of the problems that Majid mentioned very quietly at the beginning, the FX, the ability to take your capital out, capital controls, the change in regulation, that's what's holding investment back. Now, if you have a World Bank, an EBRD, and IFC with you, then you can say, not only are they going to bring in cheaper capital, but they're going to assure that the policy environment is the right one, and I can actually go in. And I think what we are able to see and are beginning to see is the challenge is a $1 trillion challenge to 2030. It's a $1.5 trillion challenge for emerging markets in developing economies. And if we don't do it, the cost of sort of adjusting to the climate is exponential. I think we've all been watching our TVs. We've all seen what's happening in different parts of the world, in the United States. We talked about it in the Sahel, in Africa, the Amazon. I think the challenge of us not being able to raise the resources, but also to deploy it, and I think that's what Alterra has done, is Alterra put the resources, and a lot of people say, oh, we have the resources, we can deploy. They have shown us that you can deploy. And I think the good news that came out yesterday is also that the GCF, the Global Climate Fund has also raised 500 million. We need this sort of blending. But everybody needs to stay in their lane so that you don't get, and I think part of the private sector's concern has been sometimes the public sector uses cheaper capital to drive away good investments in the private sector. And that slows sort of the global sort of environment. And I think what we need to do is make sure that everybody brings the right capital at the right moment so the stacks work in a way that makes it much faster to move. And I think examples from Alterra or what's happening in Brazil and with the BNDES, Masdar and many others is a very good start. The Galapagos Fund, and we've seen that, will be able to show us how you can actually blend this capital in the way that delivers much faster for us.
As we're gradually winding down, that's something that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. And as you mentioned, all of these stakeholders that have to stay in their lane, but also have to be open to bringing their fruits to the table. I want to ask what those pillars are in establishing global coalitions to really forge this climate finance for sustainable economic growth forward. What are those imperatives that we need to be seeing coalitions do going forward beyond the...
The first one, and this is the big job of the UNFCCC, right, is to bring everybody together and to make sure, because there are competing demands, there are stresses and different objectives every time. And it's really to see how we can find an optimal mix that works, not for everybody, but at least takes us forward. Yeah. With the clarity that, the objective is 1.5. It's not, we can maybe go to 2 and then come back to 1.5. No. We have to make sure that we don't go past 1.5. And I think if we keep that as sort of the North Star and where we need to get to, then getting global consensus through the UN, through the development institutions, but most importantly, and I think really glad, the private sector, I think we're in a moment now where we see banks struggling to stay in G funds, trying to get out, but also in a moment where, there's big new investments. Brookfield just did a $5 billion investment yesterday. So there is still some good news, and I think that if we can get all these people around the table in, governance systems that allow for voice for everybody, and I think this is where the just energy transition conversation and the country platforms become important, then we will get there much faster.
I like that sentiment, allow for voice.
Yeah. I think that what's exciting for me, is that I feel that we're really at a tipping point. All of us have been watching the fires in California on the news, right? And, as we think about building resilience for a changing environment, this is a perfect example of where, we need to be investing in resilience, not just in developed world, but in the developing world as well. And that if you do that, that leads to prosperity. That's an economic investment. If we invest in cleaner types of energy, Dos Sultan in the opening ceremony talked about the energy demand that is going to be coming over between now and 2050, and that just sheer demand in energy means that we need to be investing in the right types of energy, and also in how we use our resources so that we make sure that we achieve the sort of equitable growth that we all want to see. So for me, I think that what has changed is that we've gone from a conversation where we used to talk about, oh, this is a nice to have, this is something that we need to do to keep global temperature at 1.5, to today saying, hey, investing in these things will keep temperature to global degrees 1.5, but by the way, it will also help us have a more prosperous, more equitable, more resilient global community, and that is a good thing. That is something that we all need to be investing in. And so that will happen if we start to think, like Vera said, how do we get people to focus on the areas where they are most effective? How do we get the World Bank to focus on that development piece? and empowering the private sector to then come in, and then how do we get others to really address the parts of the challenge that they can, and if we can orchestrate that in a way that it can be really, really powerful. Yeah. And we've done this before, by the way. We did it after the Second World War. We reconstructed Europe. So this is something we've done before, and we can do again. Yeah, yeah.
No, it's a very powerful sentiment to end on, and thank you so much for that. I think the overall goal needs to be the sort of consolidated move away from a sort of short-term game mentality to something that's creating something that's long-lasting, something that's structurally transformative and socially transformative. And thank you so much both for your time. I think we are almost at time now. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. And thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maryam. Thank you.